and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's great to have you with us. This week we're looking at a very powerful healing story in which Jesus sets someone free who was plagued by demons, but caused real controversy in the process. Before we dive into any of that, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it helpful to download the sheet that accompanies this study. You'll find the link to it in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 8, verses 26 through to 39. Today's passage is part of a wider textual unit that runs from chapter 8, verse 22 through to chapter 9, verse 6. And it could be characterised, as one commentary puts it, as being like fourth healings and ascending. The latter, the sending out bit, tells us about the commission that was given to the 12, to Jesus' closest friends, to go out and proclaim the kingdom of God and to bring healing. That's in chapter 9, verses 1 to 6. And in each of the healing stories that comes before that, they function to show both that Jesus has real power to give to the disciples and that he does so as he equips them for their ministry. And in turn, this textual unit precedes the feeding of the 5,000, the confession by Peter that Jesus is the Messiah, and the transfiguration. So in other words, it comes just before that pivot point in the gospel where the action shifts decisively away from Galilee and towards Jerusalem. Now, Luke is not the only gospel writer to include these four healing stories. Mark, the earliest gospel to be written, also does so, and Luke follows the ordering that Mark uses. But Mark's collection of these stories is followed by Jesus being rejected in Nazareth, and so it has quite a different feel to that which Luke's does, which ends in a positive moment of sending out. And also Matthew treats these stories differently. He kind of scatters them throughout his gospel. So the arrangement that we have in Luke is very particular. And today's snippet follows on from the first of those healing stories, as it were, where Jesus stilled the storm in chapter 8, verses 22 to 25. It shows Jesus in command of creation. In Paul's letter to the Romans, he talks about the creation groaning with birth pangs. And I think there's something of that in the story of the stilling of the storm, of Jesus almost easing those pangs as he calms the waters, to the astonishment of his disciples. Today's snippet is followed by the third and fourth healing stories that are intertwined together. The story of a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhaging for a number of years, and the daughter of Jairus, who was raised from death by Jesus. So Jesus is shown to have authority over the elements, the weather, and illness, physical illness, and death. And in today's reading, as we'll see, he's shown to have authority over demons as well. So in this passage, obviously we have Jesus in the midst of a series of healings and events that set out his store, reveal his authority over all creation as the one through whom and by whom all was made. We also have an unnamed person, a demoniac. He had been released, as we'll see in this story, by Jesus from his various demons, having spent years living in a graveyard in an unclean place, a place of isolation. And finally, we have the people of the region that Jesus found himself in, the Gerasenes. These were Gentile residents, and we know that because Jewish people wouldn't have kept pigs. They were regarded as unclean animals. And we're told by Luke that this area was on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee to where Jesus primarily ministered in Galilee itself. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the four canonical Gospels to be written around 80 to 85 of the Common Era. And it was written to a predominantly Gentile audience. And that begs some interesting questions in relation to today's passage. It's also a Gospel where there's a really strong focus on inclusivity and the bringing in to God's kingdom of the Gentiles. So it's something to keep in mind as we read it, and bear in mind the geographical setting of the story of this healing narrative. It's useful to look particularly at the parallels that we find, so in Mark chapter 5 verses 1 to 20 and Matthew chapter 8 verses 28 to 34, to see how this story is told in different ways. Luke's version bears a lot more connection to Mark's, in the sense of they both go into a lot more detail than Matthew does. So Jesus and his friends had crossed over the Sea of Galilee, which was the incident of the stilling of the storm, into the country of the Gerasenes on the opposite side of the lake. And it was where the cities of the Decapolis, the 10 towns, were located, as I say, a predominantly Gentile region. So that's the context that we get from verse 26. And it seems Jesus had hardly had any time to settle down at all once they'd come ashore, when he was confronted with a man who had several demons, and as we're told in verse 27, was naked and lived in that graveyard, that unclean place. And he was kept shackled and chained and guarded there, in case he escaped and ran off into the wilderness. So he's someone who's very much been pushed to the outside and imprisoned in more ways than one. This is a tricky text for us to grapple with, perhaps as modern readers, because most of us, though admittedly this is very much a Western perspective, don't see the world as populated with demons everywhere. But that's not how things were in the ancient world. In the ancient world, demons were understood to be abundant and to be the cause of annoyance and harassment and even destruction. It's really significant that Jesus, in this passage, is able to cast out these demons, because it was believed that there was a hierarchy and that demons were responsible to someone higher up the chain, a greater, more powerful demonic force. And this shows Jesus has power, dominion, even over Gentile demons, as it were. Now in verse 28, the demons recognise who Jesus is, and they make a declaration effectively when they refer to Jesus as Son of the Most High God. And it's fascinating because while the man is made to fall at Jesus' feet in a stance that might reflect worship, the demons knowing who he is in this kind of way does not imply faithfulness to him. And it shows us, I think, that real faith in Christ is about more than just a recognition. It's about trust and commitment. The demons obviously don't have that. They're bent on destroying and keeping this man on the fringes of things, isolated, shackled, not free. Now, Jesus, as we hear it about in the verses that come after that, asked the demons what their name is, and the reply is Legion. Now that little snippet is significant in two ways. Firstly, because naming was very important in that culture, and if you extracted someone's name in a confrontational situation like that, it gave you a power over them. So it shows Jesus' sovereignty and authority over these demons. But it would also have been profoundly shocking to those looking on, because a legion was a group of 600 Roman soldiers. So it suggests that there was a massive burden that had brought this man to this point, understood in this passage in relation to being possessed by a large number of demons. I guess we might think of it in modern terms as someone who was deeply troubled and had a lot of problems that had pushed him to the outskirts, to the margins of his society. The demons, as we hear in this snippet running from verses 29 to 31, beg Jesus not to be cast out into the abyss. And so, in verses 32 to 33, we learn that Jesus gives them permission to enter a herd of pigs, an unclean animal within Jewish understanding. And the demons do indeed enter the swine, who promptly run off the cliff into the sea, and all of them drown. You can imagine how the swineherds would have felt upon witnessing this. After all, this was their livelihood, this was central to the local economy, and it was all gone in an instant, and what's more, gone in connection with this strange, dangerous, frightening person. You can understand perhaps why they were frightened of Jesus as a result, as the one who had brought this about. And these swineherders ran to draw people in, we're told, from the countryside and from the city. So urban and rural people coming to see this for themselves, beginning of verse 35. As we carry on working our way through that verse, we learn that once the pigs had drowned and effectively the demons had been taken away, there was a complete transformation in the man. He was sat at Jesus' feet, which is a very clear sign of being a disciple. Another good example is with Mary in chapter 10, verse 39. And it reminds us that Jesus had redefined, all the way back in chapter 8, verse 21, what it meant to be part of his family, to be people who hear his word and follow it. So we're showing here that this man has gone from being an outsider in extreme terms to part of the family of God, because he has been restored by Jesus. And he's now in his right mind, we're told. He's fully clothed, so he no longer has the shame of being naked, and cleaned up and at the centre of things. Now it's interesting to note in verse 36, where it talks about the man having been healed, that the Greek word that's used for healed is also the Greek word that's used for saved. So it reminds us that healing and salvation actually come together, and that God is concerned in salvation with wholeness, in what we might call nowadays body, mind and spirit. God is concerned with us as whole people, and the restoration of this man is complete in a social sense, as well as a personal, psychological and physical sense. Now, as I say, drowning these pigs would have destroyed a key part of the local economy, giving a good reason, if nothing else, for what we see in verse 37, where we're told that the residents of this Gentile region who'd been brought to Jesus were really afraid at seeing this man having been made whole. He, as we learn in verses 38 and 39, really wanted to go and join Jesus' disciples, join the 12, after the locals had said, no, you've got to leave. And Jesus and the 12 had gone to the boat and got ready to go back across the Sea of Galilee. The man wasn't, as much as he's adopted this posture of discipleship, allowed to join the 12, however. Jesus gave him a more difficult vocation, if anything, to stay where he was in his home community and proclaim what God had done for him. And as we see in these two verses, that's exactly what he went and did. And it reminds us that faithful discipleship doesn't necessarily involve going where our first instincts take us. It means listening and going where God would send us. So there's a lot going on in this passage. There's some difficult stuff for us to wrestle with in terms of how we deal with passages about demon possession within a very different worldview. There's stuff about this man being set free and what is it that binds us, perhaps. And there's also questions about vocation and calling within this wonderful, powerful, challenging narrative. And so it's with those sorts of thoughts and more in mind that we now turn to our questions for this week.